Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished stocking the last shelf at the corner grocery store. Her shift had been long, but she didn't mind the work. After 8 years in the Navy SEALs, civilian life required adjustments she hadn't expected. The transition from commanding respect in one of the military's most elite units to being just another employee in a small-town store felt strange, but Sarah embraced the normalcy. At 29, Sarah looked nothing like what people expected from a former Navy SEAL. Standing 5 feet 4 inches tall with a slight build, she often heard customers comment about how young or delicate she appeared. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the standard blue vest that all employees were required to wear. Most people saw a quiet, polite young woman who smiled when they asked questions about products or directions to different aisles. What they couldn't see were the countless hours of training that had shaped her into one of the most capable warriors the military had ever produced. They didn't know about the missions she had completed in some of the world's most dangerous places. They had no idea that beneath her calm exterior was someone who had been trained to handle situations that would break most people. Sarah had moved to the small town of Millbrook 6 months earlier, seeking peace after her military service. The town had a population of just over 8,000 people, where everyone knew everyone else's business. She rented a small apartment above the local bakery and took the job at Morrison's grocery to support herself while she figured out her next steps in civilian life. The grocery store sat on Main Street, right in the heart of downtown Millbrook. It was the kind of place where farmers came to buy supplies, families did their weekly shopping, and teenagers gathered after school to buy snacks and sodas. Sarah enjoyed the routine and the simple interactions with customers. After years of high-stress situations where lives depended on split-second decisions, the predictable rhythm of scanning barcodes and counting change felt almost therapeutic. Her manager, Mrs. Morrison, was a kind woman in her 60s who had owned the store with her husband for over 30 years. She had hired Sarah without asking too many questions about her background, something Sarah appreciated. When Mrs. Morrison asked about her previous work experience, Sarah simply mentioned she had been in the military and was looking for a fresh start. Mrs. Morrison had nodded approvingly and offered her the position on the spot. The other employees were friendly enough, though Sarah kept mostly to herself. There was Jake, a college student who worked part-time to pay for his education, and Linda, a mother of 3 who had been with the store for 15 years. Both had tried to draw Sarah into conversations about her past, but she always deflected with polite responses that revealed little about her military background. Sarah preferred it that way. She had seen how people reacted when they learned about her SEAL training. Some became uncomfortable, as if they didn't know how to behave around someone who had been trained to kill. Others bombarded her with questions about combat and classified operations she couldn't discuss. A few dismissed her accomplishments entirely, refusing to believe that someone who looked like her could have survived the brutal training that less than 20% of candidates completed successfully. The truth was that Sarah had not only survived SEAL training but had excelled in ways that surprised even her instructors. She had always been athletic, playing soccer and running track in high school, but nothing had prepared her for the physical and mental demands of becoming a SEAL. The grueling 24-week training program had pushed her to limits she didn't know existed. During Hell Week, the infamous 5.5-day period where candidates got only 4 hours of sleep total while enduring constant physical activity, Sarah had watched grown men break down and quit. She had seen tough, muscular guys who looked like they could lift cars simply walk away when the pressure became too much. But Sarah had developed a mental toughness that kept her going when her body wanted to give up. Her instructors initially doubted whether she had what it took to complete the program. They pushed her harder than the male candidates, testing her resolve at every opportunity. They wanted to see if she would crack under pressure or use her gender as an excuse when things got difficult. Sarah never gave them that satisfaction. When they told her to carry heavier loads, she carried them. When they extended her training runs, she finished them. When they criticized her performance, she improved it. The physical challenges had been brutal, but Sarah discovered that her smaller size sometimes worked to her advantage. She could move more quietly than larger team members, fit through spaces others couldn't navigate, and had better endurance during long-distance operations. Her instructors eventually stopped treating her differently and began recognizing her unique strengths. After completing basic SEAL training, Sarah had been assigned to a team that specialized in reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. She spent the next 6 years deployed around the world, participating in operations that would never be discussed in newspapers or acknowledged by government officials. She learned to speak 3 languages fluently, became an expert in hand-to-hand combat, and developed skills in everything from explosive demolition to advanced medical care. Her team members had initially been skeptical about working with a female SEAL, but Sarah quickly proved herself during their first deployment. When their unit was ambushed during a reconnaissance mission in a hostile territory, Sarah had single-handedly held off attackers while her injured teammates were evacuated. Her quick thinking and precise actions had saved 3 lives that day, earning the respect of everyone who served with her. Over the years, Sarah had participated in dozens of successful operations. She had rescued hostages, gathered critical intelligence, and eliminated threats to national security. Her superiors repeatedly commended her performance and recommended her for advancement. She had been promoted faster than most of her peers and had received several commendations for exceptional service. But after 8 years of constant deployments and high-stress operations, Sarah began to feel the weight of her service. She had lost friends in combat and had seen things that would stay with her forever. The adrenaline that once motivated her during dangerous missions started to feel more like exhaustion. She realized that she needed to step away from military life before it consumed everything she was outside of her role as a SEAL. The decision to leave the SEALs had not been easy. The military had been her identity for nearly a decade, and her teammates had become like family. But Sarah knew she needed to discover who she was when she wasn't wearing a uniform or carrying a weapon. She wanted to experience normal life, to have conversations that didn't involve mission planning or threat assessment. So she had quietly submitted her resignation, completed her final deployment, and moved to Millbrook with little more than her savings and a desire for peace. She chose the small town specifically because it was the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever happened. The most exciting news in the local paper was usually about high school football games or county fair planning meetings. For 6 months, Sarah's strategy had worked perfectly. She woke up each morning in her quiet apartment, walked to work at the grocery store, spent her days helping customers and organizing inventory, then returned home to read books or watch television. It was exactly the kind of predictable, stress-free existence she had craved after years of uncertainty and danger. The customers at Morrison's grocery had quickly grown accustomed to seeing Sarah behind the register or restocking shelves. She was always polite and helpful, though she rarely engaged in the kind of personal conversations that were common in small-town businesses. When Mrs. Henderson asked about her family, Sarah would smile and mention that she didn't have relatives in the area. When Mr. Thompson tried to discuss local politics, she would nod politely and redirect the conversation to his purchase. Sarah's co-workers respected her work ethic and reliability, even if they found her somewhat mysterious. She always arrived on time, never complained about difficult customers, and volunteered to work extra shifts when needed. Jake often commented that he had never seen someone organize inventory with such precision, joking that she arranged products like she was preparing for military inspection. Linda had been more persistent in trying to learn about Sarah's background, mentioning several times that she seemed different from other young women who had worked at the store. There was something about the way Sarah carried herself, Linda observed, like she was always aware of everything happening around her. Sarah would just smile and thank Linda for the compliment, never elaborating on what might have shaped her particular way of moving through the world. The young man's grip tightened on Sarah's wrist as his smile turned more sinister. His name was Derek Hoffman, though Sarah didn't know this yet. Derek was the son of one of Millbrook's wealthiest families, and he had spent most of his 23 years getting away with behavior that would have landed anyone else in serious trouble. His father owned several businesses in town, including the largest construction company, and Derek had learned early that his family's money and influence could solve most problems. Derek's friends, Brad, Tyler, and Marcus, had been his companions in troublemaking since high school. They formed a tight group that terrorized other students, harassed local businesses, and generally acted like they owned the town. Now that they were adults, their behavior had only gotten worse, fueled by alcohol, boredom, and the knowledge that Derek's father would always bail them out of any consequences. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Derek asked, his voice dripping with false charm. "I don't think I've seen you around here before. Trust me, I would have remembered someone as pretty as you." Sarah kept her voice steady and professional. "Sir, I need you to let go of my arm and complete your purchase. If you're not planning to buy anything, I'll have to ask you to leave the store." Derek's friends laughed louder, and Brad stepped closer to the counter. "Did you hear that, Derek? She's giving you orders. I think she needs to learn some manners." Tyler, a lanky guy with greasy black hair, pointed at Sarah's name tag. "Sarah," he read aloud. "That's a nice name. Where are you from, Sarah? You don't sound like you're from around here." Sarah had encountered men like this before, both in civilian life and during her military service. She recognized the pattern of behavior that typically escalated from verbal harassment to physical intimidation and, potentially worse. Her training had taught her to assess threats quickly and respond appropriately, but she also knew that her first priority should always be de-escalation when possible. "Gentlemen, I'm just trying to do my job," Sarah said calmly. "If you'd like to make a purchase, I'm happy to help you. Otherwise, I need to ask you to leave so I can assist other customers." Derek leaned even closer, his face now inches from Sarah's. "You know what? I don't like your attitude. Maybe someone needs to teach you how to treat customers with respect." At this point, Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who had been shopping in the back of the store, approached the counter with her groceries. She was in her 70s, walked with a cane, and had been a regular customer at Morrison's for decades. Mrs. Henderson took one look at the situation and immediately understood that something was wrong. "Excuse me," Mrs. Henderson said firmly, positioning herself next to the group of young men. "I need to pay for my groceries." Derek turned toward the elderly woman, his expression shifting to one of irritation. "Wait your turn, Grandma. We're having a conversation here." Mrs. Henderson had raised 4 children and wasn't easily intimidated. "Young man, I've known your father since he was your age, and I can guarantee he didn't raise you to behave this way in public." This comment struck a nerve with Derek, who suddenly released Sarah's wrist and spun to face Mrs. Henderson fully. "My father doesn't have anything to do with this, old woman. Why don't you mind your own business before you get hurt?" The threat against Mrs. Henderson changed everything for Sarah. She could tolerate harassment directed at herself, but she would not stand by and watch someone threaten an elderly person who was trying to help her. Her military training had ingrained certain principles that were non-negotiable, and protecting innocent people was at the top of that list. Sarah stepped out from behind the counter, moving with a fluid grace that should have warned anyone paying attention that she was not an ordinary grocery store employee. "There's no need to threaten Mrs. Henderson," she said, her voice still calm but now carrying an undertone of steel that hadn't been there before. "She's just trying to pay for her groceries." Derek's friends immediately noticed Sarah's movement and interpreted it as aggressive. Marcus, the shortest member of the group but also the most volatile, stepped forward and shoved Sarah hard in the shoulder. "Get back behind your little counter and stay there, bitch." The shove was meant to knock Sarah off balance and demonstrate the group's physical dominance. Instead, Sarah absorbed the impact and remained perfectly steady, her feet positioned in a way that maintained optimal balance and leverage. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like she was just naturally stable, but her stance was actually a combat-ready position that would allow her to move quickly in any direction. "I'm going to call the police," Mrs. Henderson announced, reaching for her cell phone with shaking hands. Tyler snatched the phone away from the elderly woman before she could dial. "I don't think so, Grandma. Nobody's calling anybody." The situation had now crossed several lines that Sarah could not ignore. The group was threatening an elderly person, preventing her from seeking help, and becoming increasingly aggressive. Sarah's training told her that these men were escalating toward violence and that intervention was necessary to prevent someone from getting seriously hurt. But Sarah also knew that revealing her capabilities too early might make the situation worse. These young men appeared to be local troublemakers who were used to intimidating people who couldn't fight back. If they realized they were dealing with someone who could defend herself, they might escalate to weapons or call for backup. Sarah decided to try one more time to de-escalate the situation through words. "Look, nobody wants any trouble here," Sarah said, addressing Derek directly. "Why don't you and your friends just leave, and we'll forget this whole thing happened?" Derek laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. "I don't think you understand how this works, sweetheart. We don't leave until we're ready to leave. And, right now, I think you owe us an apology for being rude to paying customers." Brad stepped closer to Mrs. Henderson, who was now visibly frightened. Maybe the old lady should apologize too, for sticking her nose where it doesn't belong. Sarah made a quick mental assessment of the situation. There were 4 young men, all larger than her, who had demonstrated willingness to use physical force and make threats. They were under the influence of alcohol, which made their behavior unpredictable. They had trapped an elderly woman and were preventing her from seeking help. The store was relatively isolated, with no other customers present who could assist or call for help. In a normal civilian situation, Sarah would have been frightened and looking for ways to escape or hide until help arrived. But Sarah Martinez was not a normal civilian. She was a highly trained Navy SEAL who had faced down armed terrorists in foreign countries. For drunk bullies in a grocery store represented a manageable threat level, though she still hoped to resolve the situation without violence. "Here's what's going to happen," Derek continued, his confidence growing as he interpreted Sarah's calm demeanor as fear. "You're going to apologize to me and my friends for being disrespectful. Then, you're going to give us whatever cash is in that register. And, maybe, if you're nice enough, we won't mess up this pretty little store." The demand for money transformed the encounter from harassment to armed robbery, even though Sarah hadn't seen any weapons yet. Her rules of engagement now allowed for a much more aggressive response, but she still wanted to give the young men one final chance to walk away before things got serious. "I can't give you money from the register," Sarah said calmly. But Sarah's response was so fast that Derek never saw it coming. As his hand reached for her wrist, she grabbed his extended arm with both hands, stepped to his side, and used his own momentum to flip him completely over her hip. Derek, who weighed nearly twice as much as Sarah, found himself airborne for a split second before crashing onto his back on the hard floor behind the checkout counter. The move was executed with such precision and speed that Derek's 3 friends stood frozen for a moment, unable to process what they had just witnessed. The small, quiet grocery store employee had just thrown their leader like he weighed nothing at all. Derek lay on the floor, gasping for breath and staring at the ceiling, completely stunned by what had happened to him. Brad was the first to recover from his shock. "What the hell?" he shouted, stepping toward Sarah with his fists raised. "You're going to pay for that." Sarah turned to face Brad with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the encounter. Her breathing was still normal, and she showed no signs of exertion from the move she had just performed on Derek. To Brad, it looked like she had somehow gotten lucky, and he was determined not to let her get lucky again. Brad swung a wild haymaker at Sarah's head, putting all his weight behind the punch. He was bigger and stronger than Sarah, and he expected the blow to end the fight immediately. Instead, Sarah ducked under the punch effortlessly, stepped inside Brad's reach, and delivered a precise strike to his solar plexus that dropped him to his knees, gasping and unable to breathe. Tyler and Marcus looked at each other with growing alarm. 2 of their friends were now on the floor, and the little grocery store worker was standing calmly between them as if nothing had happened. Tyler pulled out his cell phone, apparently planning to call for backup, but Sarah moved across the distance between them faster than he could dial. Sarah grabbed the phone from Tyler's hand and tossed it behind the counter, then swept his legs out from under him. Tyler hit the floor hard, his head striking the linoleum with a sound that made Mrs. Henderson wince. Marcus, now the only one still standing, backed toward the store's exit with his hands raised. "I don't want any trouble," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "We're leaving, okay? We're just leaving." Sarah positioned herself between Marcus and Mrs. Henderson, making it clear that he would have to go through her to reach the elderly woman. "You can leave after you give Mrs. Henderson her purse back and apologize to her," Sarah said calmly. Marcus quickly grabbed Mrs. Henderson's purse from where he had dropped it and handed it back to the elderly woman. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, not making eye contact. "We're really sorry. This was all just a misunderstanding." Derek was slowly getting to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and anger. He had been the leader of this group for years, and having a small woman throw him to the ground in front of his friends was humiliating beyond belief. Rather than learning from the experience and retreating, Derek's pride and alcohol-impaired judgment led him to make another catastrophic decision. "This isn't over," Derek snarled at Sarah. "Do you know who I am? My father owns half this town. You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Sarah looked at Derek with the same patient expression she might use with a child throwing a tantrum. "Your father doesn't matter right now," she said quietly. "What matters is that you threatened an elderly woman and tried to rob this store. You should leave before things get worse." Derek's face turned an even darker shade of red. No one had ever dismissed his family's influence so casually, and certainly no one had ever talked down to him the way Sarah was doing. In his twisted thinking, his reputation and masculinity were on the line, and he couldn't let this woman get away with embarrassing him. Derek reached into his jacket and pulled out a switchblade knife, clicking it open with a sharp sound that echoed through the store. "Maybe this will change your attitude," he said, waving the blade in Sarah's direction. "Let's see how tough you are now." Mrs. Henderson gasped and stepped back, but Sarah's expression didn't change at all. If anything, she looked almost disappointed, as if Derek had just confirmed her lowest expectations of his character. To Derek, her lack of fear in the face of a deadly weapon was confusing and infuriating. Sarah had faced armed opponents countless times during her military service, often in situations far more dangerous than a single drunk man with a knife in a well-lit grocery store. Her training had included extensive instruction in disarming techniques, and she had successfully taken weapons away from trained enemy combatants who were fighting for their lives. Derek's clumsy knife work and obvious inexperience with violence made him a relatively minor threat. Derek lunged at Sarah with the knife, aiming for her midsection in a wild, undisciplined attack that telegraphed his intentions from several feet away. Sarah sidestepped the blade easily, grabbed Derek's wrist, and applied a joint lock that forced him to drop the weapon. The knife clattered to the floor as Derek found himself once again completely controlled by someone half his size. This time, Sarah didn't release Derek after disarming him. Instead, she maintained the joint lock and used it to force him face first against the checkout counter. Derek struggled against her grip, but Sarah's technique was flawless, and her leverage gave her complete control over his much larger body. "Attacking someone with a knife is a felony," Sarah explained calmly, as if she were discussing the weather. "Threatening elderly people is also illegal. Attempted robbery will probably get you several years in prison, especially since you just pulled a weapon." Brad was starting to recover his breath and was attempting to get back to his feet when Sarah looked in his direction. "I wouldn't," she advised. "You're already in enough trouble." Brad immediately sat back down, apparently deciding that staying on the floor was the safer option. Tyler was still unconscious from hitting his head, and Marcus remained frozen by the exit, too scared to move or speak. Mrs. Henderson had recovered from her initial shock and was now watching the proceedings with obvious fascination. She had lived in Millbrook for over 70 years and had never seen anything like what she was witnessing. The young woman who had served her groceries dozens of times had just single-handedly defeated 4 young men who had been terrorizing the community for years. "Sarah, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, "should I call the police now?" Sarah nodded, still maintaining her grip on Derek. "That would be helpful, Mrs. Henderson. These gentlemen are going to need to explain their behavior to some officers." Derek was still struggling against Sarah's hold, his face pressed against the counter. "You don't know what you're doing," he said, his voice muffled. "My father will have your job. He'll run you out of town. You can't do this to me." Sarah's response was delivered in the same calm, professional tone she had used throughout the entire encounter. Your father isn't here right now. And even if he was, assault, robbery, and threatening people with weapons are still crimes. Money doesn't change that. The sound of sirens in the distance indicated that Mrs. Henderson's call had been successful and that law enforcement was on the way. Derek and his friends had attracted police attention several times in the past, but Derek's father had always managed to make charges disappear through a combination of financial pressure and political connections. This time felt different, though none of them could quite understand why. Officer Jennifer Walsh was the first to arrive at Morrison's grocery. She was a 10-year veteran of the Millbrook Police Department and had dealt with Derek and his friends on multiple occasions. Officer Walsh had always been frustrated by the way these cases ended, with charges being dropped and victims being pressured not to testify. Officer Walsh entered the store to find an unusual scene, for young men subdued by a small woman who looked like she could be a high school student. Derek was still being held against the counter, Brad and Tyler were sitting on the floor, and Marcus was standing motionless by the door. Sarah was completely composed, and Mrs. Henderson was calmly explaining what had happened. They threatened us, tried to rob the store, and that one pulled a knife, Mrs. Henderson was saying, pointing at Derek. Sarah here handled the whole situation beautifully. Officer Walsh looked at Sarah with obvious confusion. Did you really subdue all 4 of these men by yourself? Sarah nodded politely. They were threatening Mrs. Henderson, and one of them attempted to rob the store. When Derek pulled the knife, I had to intervene to protect myself and Mrs. Henderson. Officer Walsh had been a police officer long enough to recognize when something didn't add up. For young men, all of them significantly larger than Sarah, claiming to have been defeated by a grocery store employee seemed impossible. Yet the evidence was right in front of her. Derek was clearly restrained, the other 3 were obviously intimidated, and there was a knife on the floor. What's your full name? Officer Walsh asked Sarah. Sarah Martinez, Sarah replied. I work here at Morrison's. Officer Walsh nodded and began taking statements from everyone involved. Derek and his friends tried to claim that Sarah had attacked them for no reason, but their stories were inconsistent and contradicted by the physical evidence. Mrs. Henderson provided a clear, detailed account of everything that had happened, and her reputation in the community gave her testimony significant weight. As more officers arrived, Derek became increasingly agitated. He demanded that they arrest Sarah for assault and insisted that his father be called immediately. The officers knew Derek's history and his family's influence, but they also knew they couldn't ignore clear evidence of criminal activity just because of political pressure. News of the incident at Morrison's grocery spread through Millbrook with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. By the next morning, everyone in town knew that Derek Hoffman and his friends had been arrested for trying to rob the store and threatening Mrs. Henderson. What made the story even more interesting was that they had been stopped by Sarah Martinez, the quiet young woman who worked behind the counter. Most people found the story hard to believe. Derek and his friends were well-known troublemakers, but they were also big, strong young men who had intimidated people throughout the town for years. The idea that someone like Sarah could have handled all 4 of them seemed impossible to most residents. Mrs. Henderson, however, was more than happy to tell anyone who would listen exactly what she had witnessed. She described Sarah's movements with the enthusiasm of someone recounting an action movie, emphasizing how calm and controlled Sarah had remained throughout the entire confrontation. I've never seen anything like it, Mrs. Henderson told her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, over coffee the morning after the incident. That Derek boy came at her with a knife, and she just took it away from him like she was taking candy from a baby. She moved so fast I could barely follow what was happening. Mrs. Patterson, who had known Mrs. Henderson for 40 years, trusted her friend's account completely. What do you think Sarah's background is? She asked. Nobody learns to do things like that working in a grocery store. Mrs. Henderson shook her head thoughtfully. I don't know, but there's definitely more to that girl than meets the eye. She was trained by someone, that's for certain. The way she handled herself wasn't luck or accident. Meanwhile, Derek's father, Richard Hoffman, was having the worst morning of his professional life. Richard had built his construction empire through a combination of hard work, strategic partnerships, and careful cultivation of political relationships. He was used to solving his son's problems with phone calls and financial contributions to the right people. But this time was different. The charges against Derek were serious, there were witnesses, and physical evidence. More importantly, the story was spreading throughout the community, and public opinion was strongly against Derek and his friends. Richard's usual strategy of quietly making problems disappear wouldn't work when half the town was talking about the case. Richard's first call was to his lawyer, David Sterling, who had helped the family navigate Derek's previous legal troubles. Sterling's assessment of the situation was grim. "Richard, this is bad," Sterling explained over the phone. "Derek and his friends are being charged with attempted robbery, assault, making terroristic threats, and weapons violations. They had a knife, they threatened an elderly woman, and they tried to rob a business. These aren't charges I can make disappear with a few phone calls." Richard was accustomed to Sterling's ability to work behind the scenes to protect Derek from consequences. "What do you mean you can't make them disappear? We've done it before." Sterling sighed. The previous incidents were minor things: bar fights, vandalism, disturbing the peace. Those charges could be reduced or dropped without attracting too much attention. But this involved a weapon and threats against an elderly woman who's been a pillar of this community for decades. The district attorney can't ignore this, even if they wanted to. Richard's second call was to District Attorney Patricia Reynolds, who had been a recipient of his campaign contributions for years. But instead of the friendly conversation he expected, Reynolds was cool and professional. "Richard, I understand your concern for your son, but my hands are tied on this one," Reynolds told him. "Derek and his friends committed serious crimes in front of witnesses. Mrs. Henderson is one of the most respected people in this county, and the whole town is talking about how these boys threatened her. I can't be seen as protecting criminals just because of who their fathers are." Richard tried to apply pressure, mentioning his past support and hinting at future contributions, but Reynolds remained firm. The political cost of appearing to protect Derek would be far higher than any benefit she might gain from helping the Hoffman family. As Richard made more calls, he discovered that his usual network of influence was reluctant to help. The story had captured public attention in a way that made it politically dangerous for anyone to be seen as protecting Derek and his friends. At the county jail, Derek was experiencing his first night in a cell. His 3 friends had been released on bail, but Derek's charges were more serious because he had been the one with the knife. He spent the night demanding to speak with his father and threatening to sue everyone involved in his arrest. Derek's cellmate was an older man named Frank who had been arrested for public intoxication. Frank had lived in Millbrook his entire life and had watched Derek's behavior for years with growing disgust. He listened to Derek's rants for about an hour before offering some unwelcome perspective. "Son," Frank said, "you might want to consider that you brought this on yourself. You threatened an old lady, tried to rob a store, and pulled a knife on someone. Most folks around here think you got exactly what you deserved." Derek's response was predictably defensive. "That woman attacked me for no reason. I was just having a conversation, and she went crazy. When my father gets me out of here, she's going to pay for what she did." Frank shook his head sadly. "Boy, you still don't get it, do you? That little grocery store worker handed you your ass in front of the whole town. Whatever she is, she's not just some ordinary girl. You picked a fight with the wrong person." Back at Morrison's grocery, Sarah was trying to return to her normal routine, but the events of the previous day had made that impossible. Customers who had barely noticed her before were now staring at her with obvious curiosity. Some approached her with questions about the incident, while others seemed almost afraid of her. Mrs. Morrison had come in early to check on Sarah and assess any damage to the store. Fortunately, the confrontation had been contained to a small area near the registers, and only a few items had been knocked off shelves during the struggle. "Sarah, you all right?" Mrs. Morrison asked with genuine concern. "I can't believe something like this happened in my store. If you need some time off to recover, I completely understand." Sarah appreciated Mrs. Morrison's concern, but she was eager to get back to her normal routine. "Thank you, Mrs. Morrison, but I'm fine. Yesterday was unusual, but I'd prefer to just get back to work if that's okay." Mrs. Morrison studied Sarah's face, looking for signs of trauma or distress. What she saw instead was the same calm, competent employee she had known for 6 months. If anything, Sarah seemed less affected by the violent confrontation than Mrs. Morrison herself. "Can I ask you something, Sarah?" Mrs. Morrison said carefully. "How did you learn to handle yourself like that?" "Mrs. Henderson says you moved like you had professional training." This was the question Sarah had been dreading. Her peaceful anonymity in Millbrook was over, and people were going to start asking about her background. She had hoped to avoid these conversations indefinitely, but yesterday's events had made that impossible. "I served in the military for several years," Sarah said simply. "They taught us basic self-defense as part of our training." Mrs. Morrison nodded, accepting this explanation even though she suspected there was much more to the story. "Well, whatever they taught you, I'm grateful you were here yesterday. Mrs. Henderson could have been seriously hurt if you hadn't intervened." As the morning progressed, more customers came into the store, and many of them wanted to discuss the previous day's events. Sarah tried to deflect their questions politely, but it was clear that her days of anonymity were over. Jake arrived for his shift looking excited and slightly intimidated. He had heard about the incident from multiple sources and could barely contain his curiosity about working alongside someone who had taken down 4 attackers. "Sarah, is it true you threw Derek Hoffman across the store?" Jake asked as soon as Mrs. Morrison was out of earshot. Sarah continued stocking shelves as she answered. "Derek and his friends were causing trouble, and I helped resolve the situation. It wasn't as dramatic as people are making it sound." Jake persisted with more questions about Sarah's military service and training, but Sarah skillfully redirected the conversation to work-related topics. She could see that Jake's perception of her had changed completely, and she suspected that this was just the beginning of how differently people would treat her now. Around noon, a man in an expensive suit entered the store and approached Sarah directly. He introduced himself as David Sterling, Derek's lawyer, and asked if he could speak with her privately. "Ms. Martinez, I represent Derek Hoffman and his friends," Sterling said in his most professional voice. "I'd like to discuss the events that occurred here yesterday and see if we might be able to resolve this situation amicably." Sarah recognized this as an attempt to pressure her into changing her story or dropping charges. She had seen similar tactics used against witnesses during her military service, and she knew how to respond. "Mr. Sterling, I told the police exactly what happened, and my statement was accurate. If you have questions about the case, you should speak with the district attorney's office." Sterling tried a different approach. "Ms. Martinez, I think there may have been some misunderstandings about what happened. Young men sometimes behave poorly when they've been drinking, but that doesn't mean they intended to commit serious crimes. Perhaps we could discuss a resolution that would be beneficial for everyone involved." Sarah's expression remained neutral, but her tone became slightly cooler. "There were no misunderstandings, Mr. Sterling. Derek and his friends threatened Mrs. Henderson, attempted to rob this store, and Derek pulled a knife. These are facts, not interpretations." Sterling realized that his usual tactics weren't going to work with Sarah. Most witnesses in cases like this were intimidated by legal pressure or swayed by offers of compensation. Sarah seemed completely unmoved by both approaches. "Ms. Martinez, I should mention that Derek's family has significant reso 3 weeks after the incident at Morrison's grocery, the preliminary hearing for Derek Hoffman and his friends arrived. The courtroom was packed with curious residents of Millbrook who had never seen anything this dramatic happen in their quiet town. Word had spread that Sarah Martinez would be testifying, and everyone wanted to see the woman who had single-handedly stopped Derek's crew. District Attorney Patricia Reynolds had prepared her case carefully. The evidence was overwhelming: witness testimony from Mrs. Henderson, security camera footage from the store, physical evidence including the knife Derek had dropped, and Sarah's clear, consistent statement about what had occurred. Derek's defense team, led by David Sterling and two additional lawyers hired by Richard Hoffman, had spent weeks trying to find weaknesses in the prosecution's case. They had investigated Sarah's background thoroughly, hoping to find something that would discredit her testimony or explain her unusual capabilities. What they discovered changed everything. Sterling's private investigator had finally traced Sarah's military records, despite the classified nature of much of her service. The investigator, a former military officer himself, recognized the significance of what he had found and reported back to Sterling with obvious concern. "Mr. Sterling, you need to understand what we're dealing with here," the investigator explained during their meeting. "Sarah Martinez isn't just a former soldier. She's a former Navy SEAL. She served for 8 years in one of the most elite special operations units in the world. This woman has been trained to neutralize threats that would challenge entire teams of regular soldiers." Sterling felt his confidence in Derek's case evaporate completely. "Are you telling me that Derek picked a fight with a Navy SEAL?" The investigator nodded grimly. "Not just any SEAL, either. According to what I could piece together from unclassified sources, Martinez was involved in multiple high-level operations overseas. She's been decorated for valor under fire and commended for saving the lives of her teammates in combat situations. Derek and his friends are lucky to be alive." Sterling immediately shared this information with Richard Hoffman, hoping it might convince the family to accept a plea bargain rather than going to trial. Richard's reaction was not what Sterling expected. "So she's some kind of soldier," Richard said dismissively. "That doesn't give her the right to attack my son. If anything, it proves she used excessive force. No trained fighter should be working in a grocery store and attacking civilians." Sterling tried to explain the legal implications. "Richard, this information actually makes Derek's case much worse. A jury will see that your son threatened an elderly woman and pulled a knife on someone who had dedicated 8 years of her life to serving the country. Sarah Martinez is going to be seen as a hero, not an aggressor." But Richard refused to consider a plea bargain. His pride and reputation were on the line, and he was determined to use every resource at his disposal to protect Derek from consequences. He instructed Sterling to attack Sarah's credibility and argue that her military training made her the real threat in the situation. On the morning of the hearing, Sarah arrived at the courthouse wearing a simple blue dress and looking exactly like what she was, a quiet, professional young woman who had gotten caught up in an unfortunate situation. She had no idea that Derek's legal team had discovered her military background, and she was hoping to testify without having to reveal details about her service. Mrs. Henderson arrived shortly after Sarah, accompanied by several friends who wanted to support her. The elderly woman had become something of a local celebrity since the incident, and her account of Sarah's heroic intervention had grown more dramatic with each telling. Derek entered the courtroom in an expensive suit, flanked by his 3 lawyers and his father. He looked confident and defiant, apparently convinced that his family's money and legal representation would secure his freedom. His friends Brad, Tyler, and Marcus were also present with their own attorneys, though their cases were less serious since they hadn't been the ones with the weapon. Judge Margaret Foster, who had presided over Millbrook Circuit Court for 15 years, called the hearing to order. She was known for her fairness and her refusal to be influenced by political pressure, which had made her one of the most respected judges in the region. District Attorney Reynolds presented the prosecution's case first, calling Mrs. Henderson to testify about what she had witnessed. The elderly woman's account was clear and compelling, describing how Derek and his friends had threatened her, attempted to rob the store, and escalated to violence when Sarah tried to protect her. Sarah was so calm and professional, Mrs. Henderson told the courtroom. Even when that boy pulled the knife, she never looked scared or angry. She just did what needed to be done to protect us both. Reynolds then called Officer Jennifer Walsh, who testified about the scene she had found when she arrived at the store. Officer Walsh described Derek being restrained, his friends on the floor or by the exit, and the knife that had been dropped during the confrontation. "In 10 years as a police officer, I've never seen anything like it," Officer Walsh testified. For young men had been completely subdued by one person, without any weapons or backup. It was remarkable. When Sarah was called to testify, she walked to the witness stand with the same calm composure she had shown throughout the incident at the store. She was sworn in and took her seat, looking directly at the judge as Reynolds began her questioning. Sarah's testimony was factual and precise. She described how Derek and his friends had entered the store, how they had harassed her and threatened Mrs. Henderson, and how Derek had escalated to robbery and then pulled a knife. She explained her actions as necessary to protect herself and Mrs. Henderson from immediate threats. "I gave them multiple opportunities to leave peacefully," Sarah testified. "I only used force when Derek pulled the knife and it became clear that Mrs. Henderson and I were in immediate danger." Reynolds was careful not to ask about Sarah's military background, hoping to keep the focus on the specific events at the grocery store. But Derek's defense team had different plans. When Sterling began his cross-examination, he immediately went on the attack. "Ms. Martinez, isn't it true that you have extensive training in combat and violence?" Sarah paused for a moment, realizing that her military background had been discovered. "I served in the military for 8 years, if that's what you're asking." Sterling pressed harder. "Not just the military, Ms. Martinez. You were a Navy SEAL, weren't you? One of the most elite and deadly fighting units in the world." The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs. Most of the residents had never met a Navy SEAL, and the revelation explained Sarah's seemingly impossible victory over Derek and his friends. Judge Foster called for order, and Sarah answered simply, "Yes, I served as a Navy SEAL." Sterling thought he had found an opening to attack Sarah's credibility. "So you're telling this court that a highly trained killer was working in a grocery store? Don't you think that's suspicious? Don't you think someone with your background might have been looking for an excuse to use violence?" This line of questioning backfired spectacularly. Instead of making Sarah look suspicious, it made Derek and his friends look even worse. Sterling had essentially argued that his clients had threatened an elderly woman and pulled a knife on a decorated military veteran who had served the country with distinction. Sarah's response was delivered with quiet dignity. "I served my country for 8 years in some of the most dangerous places in the world. After completing my service, I came to Millbrook looking for a peaceful life. I took a job at Morrison's Grocery because I wanted to help people in a simple, positive way. I never wanted to use my training in a civilian setting, but Derek and his friends gave me no choice when they threatened Mrs. Henderson and pulled a weapon." The courtroom was completely silent as Sarah continued. "Everything I learned in the military was about protecting innocent people from those who would harm them. That's exactly what I did at Morrison's Grocery." Reynolds used her redirect examination to establish Sarah's military record more clearly. With the information already revealed, there was no longer any reason to keep Sarah's service history secret. "Ms. Martinez, can you tell the court about your military service?" Reynolds asked. Sarah provided a brief summary of her 8 years as a Navy SEAL, including her multiple deployments and commendations for valor. She explained that she had been trained to neutralize threats while minimizing harm to innocent people, which was exactly what she had done when confronted by Derek and his friends. "I used the minimum amount of force necessary to end the threat," Sarah explained. "I could have seriously injured Derek and his friends, but I chose to simply restrain them until police arrived. My training taught me to protect people, not hurt them unnecessarily." By the time Sarah finished her testimony, the mood in the courtroom had shifted completely. She was no longer seen as a grocery store employee who had gotten lucky in a fight. She was a decorated military veteran who had used her skills to protect an elderly woman from criminals. Sterling tried to call Derek to testify in his own defense, but Derek's arrogance and entitlement shone through every answer he gave. He showed no remorse for threatening Mrs. Henderson, continued to insist that pulling the knife was justified, and maintained that Sarah had attacked him without provocation. When Reynolds cross-examined Derek, she systematically destroyed his credibility by highlighting the contradictions in his story and his complete lack of accountability for his actions. "Mr. Hoffman, do you believe it's acceptable to threaten elderly women?" Reynolds asked. Derek's answer was telling. "I wasn't threatening anyone. I was just trying to get some respect. By pulling a knife on a woman who had served 8 years protecting this country, Derek's response revealed everything the court needed to know about his character. "I didn't know she was in the military. Besides, that doesn't give her the right to attack paying customers." Judge Foster had heard enough. After brief closing arguments, she announced her decision. "The evidence in this case is clear and overwhelming," Judge Foster stated. Derek Hoffman and his co-defendants threatened an elderly woman, attempted to rob a business, and escalated to weapons when their demands weren't met. Ms. Martinez acted in defense of herself and Mrs. Henderson, using appropriate force to neutralize a legitimate threat. Derek was bound over for trial on charges of attempted robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and making terroristic threats. His friends received lesser charges but would also face trial. As the hearing concluded, Derek's father Richard approached Sarah outside the courthouse. His face was red with anger, and he made one final attempt to intimidate her. "This isn't over, young lady," Richard said loudly enough for nearby reporters to hear. "My family has been in this town for generations. We have resources you can't imagine. You've made enemies of the wrong people." Sarah looked at Richard with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. "Mr. Hoffman, your son threatened an elderly woman and pulled a knife. No amount of money or influence changes that. Maybe instead of threatening me, you should think about getting Derek some help before he hurts someone." The local newspaper headline the next day read, "Navy SEAL working as grocery clerk stops armed robbery." The story spread beyond Millbrook, eventually reaching national news outlets interested in the story of a decorated military veteran who had quietly returned to civilian life only to find herself protecting innocent people once again. Derek was eventually sentenced to 3 years in prison after refusing multiple plea bargain offers. His friends received shorter sentences and community service. Richard Hoffman's attempts to use his influence to protect Derek had backfired completely, damaging his reputation and business relationships throughout the region. Sarah continued working at Morrison's grocery, though her life in Millbrook was forever changed. She was no longer anonymous, but she found that most people treated her with respect and gratitude rather than fear. Mrs. Henderson became one of her closest friends, and the elderly woman never tired of telling people about the day a Navy SEAL saved her life at the grocery store. 6 months later, Sarah received an unexpected visit at the store. A man in a military uniform approached her checkout counter and introduced himself as Colonel James Patterson from the Army Special Operations Command. "Ms. Martinez, we've been following your story," Colonel Patterson said. "We have a position opening that might interest you. We need someone with your skills to help train the next generation of special operations personnel. The work would be challenging, but it would allow you to serve your country again while helping others develop the capabilities that you demonstrated so effectively." Sarah listened to the colonel's offer with interest. She had found peace in Millbrook, but she also missed the sense of purpose that had defined her military career. The opportunity to train others while still maintaining some connection to civilian life appealed to her. "I'll need some time to think about it," Sarah said. "Of course," Colonel Patterson replied. "But I hope you'll consider it. The country needs people like you, Ms. Martinez. People who understand that true strength comes from protecting others, not from intimidating them." As Sarah finished her shift that evening, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come to Millbrook seeking anonymity and peace, but had instead found a new kind of purpose. Whether she accepted the colonel's offer or continued working at Morrison's grocery, she knew that her story had become something larger than herself. Derek Hoffman had learned, in the most humiliating way possible, why you never pick a fight with a Navy SEAL. But, more importantly, the community of Millbrook had learned what real heroism looked like: quiet, humble, and always focused on protecting others rather than seeking glory. Sarah's story became a reminder that heroes don't always look like what we expect, and that the most dangerous opponents are often those who seek no conflict at all but will not hesitate to act when innocent people need protection. Urses and influence in this community. Fighting these charges could become very expensive and time-consuming for you. It might be in your best interest to reconsider your position. This veiled threat was exactly the wrong approach to take with someone who had spent years facing down enemies of the United States. Sarah looked directly into Sterling's eyes with an expression that made the lawyer suddenly uncomfortable. "Mr. Sterling," Derek threatened an elderly woman and pulled a knife in front of witnesses. "Your client committed multiple felonies, and no amount of money or influence is going to change that. If you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Sterling left the store knowing that his mission had failed completely. Sarah Martinez was not going to be intimidated, bought off, or convinced to change her story. For the first time in his career handling Derek's legal problems, Sterling began to suspect that the Hoffman family's money might not be enough to make this situation go away. Sarah answered all questions politely and cooperatively, providing a factual account of events without elaborating on her background or training. To the officers, she seemed remarkably calm for someone who had just been involved in a violent confrontation, but they attributed this to shock or natural resilience. The investigation was straightforward. 4 men had threatened an elderly woman, attempted to rob a business, and 1 had brandished a weapon. There were witnesses, physical evidence, and clear statements from victims. Even Derek's father's influence would have difficulty making these charges disappear completely. As Derek and his friends were being loaded into police cars, Derek continued to threaten Sarah with legal retaliation and promised that she would regret her actions. Sarah listened to his threats with the same patient expression she had maintained throughout the encounter, showing no signs of concern about his promises of revenge. "Can I ask you one more time to leave peacefully? After that, things are going to get complicated." Derek's friends exchanged glances, apparently unsure what to make of Sarah's continued composure. Most people they had intimidated in the past had either fled or broken down crying by this point. Sarah's refusal to show fear was unusual enough to make them slightly uncomfortable, though they weren't smart enough to recognize it as a warning sign. Marcus decided to escalate the physical intimidation. He moved behind Mrs. Henderson and grabbed her purse, yanking it away from her roughly enough that the elderly woman stumbled and nearly fell. "Maybe we'll just take what we want," he announced. That action removed any remaining doubt from Sarah's mind about how this situation needed to end. These men had crossed from harassment to robbery to physically assaulting an elderly person. They had demonstrated that they were willing to hurt innocent people to get what they wanted, and they showed no signs of backing down or responding to reasonable requests. Sarah's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her weight moving to the balls of her feet and her hands positioning themselves where they could react quickly to threats. To most observers, she still looked like a scared grocery store employee, but her body was now in full tactical mode. "Give Mrs. Henderson her purse back," Sarah said, her voice carrying a new quality that made all 4 men look at her more carefully. Derek stepped closer to Sarah, close enough that he could grab her again. "Or what? What are you going to do about it, little girl?" Sarah's training had taught her that when violence became inevitable, the key to survival was striking first, striking hard, and ending the threat quickly. Prolonged fights were dangerous because they allowed for too many variables and gave opponents time to coordinate their attacks or retrieve weapons. The best strategy was to disable the primary threat immediately and then deal with the remaining opponents while they were still in shock. Derek reached out to grab Sarah's wrist again, apparently believing that the same intimidation tactic that had worked before would continue to be effective. This was his final mistake in a day filled with poor decisions. As Derek's hand moved toward her, Sarah's 8 years of Navy SEAL training took over completely. The grocery store employee disappeared, and in her place stood one of the most dangerous people in the building, possibly in the entire town. Derek and his friends were about to learn why you never pick a fight with a Navy SEAL, especially one who had spent years protecting innocent people from threats just like them. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that what happened next would seem almost impossible to anyone who hadn't witnessed the incredible capabilities that elite military training could develop in the right person. The truth was that Sarah couldn't completely turn off the training that had been drilled into her during her years as a SEAL. She automatically scanned rooms for potential threats, positioned herself where she could see exits, and remained alert to changes in people's behavior or tone of voice. These habits had become so natural that she barely noticed them anymore, but they sometimes made her seem unusually observant to people who didn't understand their origin. Despite her hypervigilance, Sarah genuinely enjoyed her work at the grocery store. She liked helping elderly customers reach items on high shelves, assisting parents with young children navigate the store efficiently, and providing directions to tourists who stopped to ask about local attractions. There was something satisfying about solving simple problems and making people's days a little easier. Sarah had been looking forward to finishing her shift and heading home when she noticed the group of young men enter the store. There were 4 of them, probably in their early 20s, and something about their energy immediately put her on alert. They were loud and boisterous, clearly under the influence of alcohol despite it being only late afternoon on a Tuesday. The group made their way through the store, knocking items off shelves and laughing at their own crude jokes. Sarah watched them from behind the register, noting their aggressive body language and the way they seemed to be looking for trouble rather than shopping for groceries. She had seen this type of behavior before, during bar fights she had witnessed in various ports during her military service. Mrs. Morrison was in the back office working on paperwork, and Linda had left early for a doctor's appointment. Jake was supposed to be working but had called in sick, leaving Sarah alone in the store with just a few regular customers who were quietly going about their shopping. Sarah hoped the group would make their purchases quickly and leave without causing any problems. But as the young men approached the counter, Sarah could see that they had no intention of making this a simple transaction. Their leader, a muscular guy with short blonde hair and an expensive leather jacket, looked her up and down with an expression that made her skin crawl. His 3 friends flanked him, all wearing similar leather jackets and sporting the kind of smug expressions that suggested they were used to intimidating people. The leader placed a single pack of gum on the counter and leaned forward, invading Sarah's personal space in a way that was clearly meant to make her uncomfortable. His breath smelled like beer and cigarettes, and when he smiled, his teeth were stained yellow. Sarah maintained her professional composure, rang up the gum, and told him the total price. Instead of paying, the young man reached across the counter and grabbed Sarah's wrist. His grip was tight enough to be painful, and his friends laughed as if this was the funniest thing they had ever seen. Sarah looked directly into his eyes and calmly asked him to let go of her arm and complete his purchase. The situation was escalating quickly, and Sarah found herself automatically shifting into a different mindset. The peaceful grocery store employee was still there, but underneath, her SEAL training was beginning to activate. She remained outwardly calm, but her body was preparing for the possibility that this encounter might require a different kind of response than customer service.